Good afternoon, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining us for EnergySource Innovation Stream, where we aim to highlight new energy technologies with the potential to reshape the global energy system through discussions with companies and individuals working diligently to bring those innovations to market at scale. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Jennifer Holmgren, Chief Executive Officer of LanzaTech, on how carbon can be recycled into valuable and sustainable new products through LanzaTech's new CarbonSmart technology. But before we get started, two administrative details. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag InnovationStream. Second, after Jennifer's presentation, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll try to get to as many of these questions as I can. If you're watching on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we cannot take your questions. So please let me welcome Jennifer Holmgren to the Atlantic Council. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. I think the last time we had you at an Atlantic Council event was for our 2019 Global Energy Forum in Abu Dhabi, where you spoke on a panel about aviation biofuels.
That's right, and it's great to see you again. Thank you for the invitation.
It's our pleasure. And you should be excited to know that we have another report on aviation biofuels coming out tomorrow. And this report looks at pragmatic policy solutions to advance sustainable aviation fuels in the United States. And we were really appreciative of getting LanzaTech's input on this paper. So I hope you enjoy what we produce. So how are you managing the quarantine?
Yeah, well, for me, it's great. I'm home with my family. It's been a really long time since I've spent so much continuous time. But I have to say it's tough on the business and it's tough on the team not being able to be together. But this too shall pass and we will manage through it.
And do you think that there's going to be as much momentum on the types of technologies that you're working on following the pandemic when we get on the other side of this?
I do, because I think diversifying the feedstock pool is a resilience argument. And I think if there's anything we've learned during this pandemic is that resilience is important. So I don't see a loss of momentum. I see a lot of government support for what you would call green infrastructure. So we're going to take it as it comes.
Fantastic. Well, why don't we get started with your presentation? If you can share your screen.
Excellent. There you go.
So Jennifer will present her CarbonSmart technology, and then we'll go to Q&A after that. So Jennifer, over to you to get started.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So I'm just going to give a really fast introduction to LanzaTech, starting from the basics. So what LanzaTech does is known as gas fermentation. So we take gas streams instead of taking sugar. We have a bioreactor and a bacteria that converts those gases to ethanol, just like making beer, except without the sugar. We tend to start off with industrial gas streams like carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide that are commonly found in refineries, steel mills, ferroalloy plants. We make ethanol that we've been using to blend with gasoline. We have, as you said, Randy, taking ethanol and converted it to jet fuel. Interestingly, the bacteria is alive in the bioreactor and it divides. And so about 10% of the carbon ends up as biomass. This biomass has about 90% protein. So it makes excellent animal food, fish food. Obviously, you can get the same types of gases by gasifying feedstocks like municipal solid waste or biomass. And longer term, we're doing synthetic biology work to be able to engineer our bacteria to make other products like isopropyl alcohol, acetone, etc. I know this is, to me, this is really exciting. I know sometimes it sounds like science fiction, but it's not. This is actually a commercial production facility in China at a steel mill. That green pipe you see at the bottom brings the carbon monoxide from the steel mill to our bioreactors, where those are converted to ethanol. Since we started up this plant in 2018, we've produced more than 13 million gallons of ethanol. The plant is operating just fantastic right now. And we think about this as mitigation of CO2 emissions. And our little ticker shows more than 70,000 tons of CO2 emissions avoided. The way we think about what we do is shown in this slide. You're basically taking a flue gas stream that would traditionally be either flared or converted to power, and then emitted as CO2. And what we do instead is we convert that to ethanol, giving it one more use. Now, obviously, if it's a fuel, it's still going to end up in the atmosphere. But what you've done is you've avoided that single use of carbon emission. The other thing that this does is I think it starts to drive carbon out of the grid, which I think is really important, because if we're going to be on a carbon budget, we really need to put carbon where we need it, which is in fuels, especially aviation fuel, and also chemicals. We're not going to make chemicals without carbon. We need carbon for chemicals production. The way I think about our technology shown here, it's basically a platform. You don't change this piece. You compress a gas and you take it all through ethanol. We can start with the industrial gases I've just shown you. I've also shown you that you can gasify. So the way I think about that is the easiest way to do it is to go directly from an industrial site into the reactor. But if you have a solid, you can gasify it. So you pay for another piece of metal and you incorporate that, but you then use the same back-end technology. If you want to just use CO2, you need to either convert that CO2 to CO through electrolysis or add hydrogen. Again, you can generate hydrogen from electrolysis. You add another piece of metal, but you can capture CO2 from industrial sites. And of course, people are working on direct air capture, and that can also be combined by adding a direct capture unit in front of the electrolyzer in front of our unit. I like to think of it this way because what I like about our technology is it's a platform. We're not married to one feedstock, and we enable a variety of feedstocks. I mentioned the plant on the very far right, the Shougang plant that is operating right now. It's a commercially operating facility at a steel mill. We are building 2 additional plants right now, one with ArcelorMittal, also at a steel mill, and one with Indian Oil in India at a refining facility. The one with ArcelorMittal is in Ghent, and they've already started construction and are pretty far along. The one with Indian Oil, that plant has all the long lead items. So both of these plants are expected to come into play in 2021. We are also raising the financing for a ferroalloy off-gas plant in South Africa, and a biomass gasification plant in California. And we're doing some work in Japan on municipal solid waste. The way I want to aggregate this is to think about this as if you just think about these feedstocks through gasification or industrial sites, we imagine we can produce on the order of 500 billion gallons of ethanol. And I think we all know that the world doesn't necessarily need 500 billion gallons of ethanol. But the point is, this is actually something that could have a real impact instead of in terms of feedstock. So having said that about that would be more ethanol than we need, I think of ethanol as a substrate. I think of ethanol as something that you could use to make other products. The reality is that carbon in municipal solid waste, carbon in a steel mill off gas, that carbon and that energy cannot be easily moved. However, if you convert it to ethanol, you could move it to other locations where you could, for example, produce aviation fuel. This is actually work we've done in collaboration with the Department of Energy and PNNL, and that we're scaling up now, and we'll soon be talking about large-scale production of our LanzaJet technology, where we can take ethanol from a variety of sources and convert that to aviation fuel. This particular picture was taken after we flew a flight using recycled carbon emissions from Orlando to Gatwick with Virgin Atlantic. We are also working on taking that ethanol and making other products like PET or PE, polyethylene, and we're working with partners to do that. We don't want to reinvert converting ethanol to other products. So if you will, when you think about PET and how PET is made, and of course PET is used for fibers and plastics, it's normally produced from taking ethylene, converting that to MEG via ethylene oxide, and then combining with PTA to make that final PET product. What we have started to do is taking our recycled carbon ethanol and taking that ethanol, working with partner IGL, Indian Glycols, and taking that ethanol, bypassing the ethylene step and taking that to MEG. I would add that Far Eastern will then be taking that MEG and converting it to PET. So there really isn't anything new here other than using our ethanol, and that's what we call CarbonSmart, starting with recycled carbon emissions. But one of the things I want to introduce you to is what I call my holy grail, and that would be using synthetic biology to take those gases, and instead of going through ethanol, going from those gases directly to MEG. And our synthetic biology team has shown that they can do this. It's something we need to scale. But we're really excited about that because then you start bypassing multiple steps in the current supply chain. So the way we think about using this is a little different than the thermochemical world. So here in biology, because an organism, whether it's the one that produces ethanol or the one that produces MEG, can only live under certain conditions, you can imagine that a bioreactor that you've built, like that commercially operating plant in China, which is making ethanol, can then be combined with an organism, and that could be our ethanol organism or MEG organism. Let's call that the software, to make other products. And so all of a sudden you start to imagine the hardware as almost a toll manufacturing facility to make products on demand at the location you want them. And I think this is actually an important way to think about it, because for the bioeconomy to flourish, it needs not to try to compete with our current fossil economy head to head. It needs to bring things that are different, that enable it to do things differently, so that we create alternate paths that integrate our current fossil economy with a new bioeconomy. At the end of the day, reducing the overall carbon footprint. And so you can imagine a view now where you have a fully circular economy. You can imagine taking waste plastics, gasifying them, converting it to ethanol or MEG, converting that back to plastics as a chemical recycling approach. And I'll end with that and just say that our view is that the circular economy will become increasingly important, and that the reuse of carbon or anything that's single use will eventually disappear as we all learn how to harness the power of recycling, even at a fundamental level, at the fundamental carbon level. So thank you very much for that, and I look forward to your questions.
Jennifer, thank you. If you could stop sharing your screen, we'll turn it over to questions now. And we're starting to get questions from the audience. So remember, use the Q&A function if you have any questions. But I want to get started. I mean, first of all, just wow, this is incredible. You're right that it does sort of seem like science fiction, but you're already using this technology. In terms of cost, how much does say a gallon of aviation jet that you produce cost compared to a traditional fossil? And I don't compare it to this oil price market, but say a more regular oil price market that we've seen over the past few years.
Yeah, I would say that this approach would be competitive. Let's talk about an $80 a barrel type of market scenario. That's how I think about it.
Oh, so that's competitive in a lot of the time over the past decade or so. And if there is even a small price on carbon, you become cost competitive right away. Whether or not you endorse that policy, it's just a good way of, in my mind, of thinking about how that works. Our friend Lee Beck has a question. What kind of policy mechanisms would help improve the business case for you?
That's a great question, Lee. I would say, look, a world where there are incentives to reduce carbon emission. So whether it's a carbon tax or some incentive like the low carbon fuel standard, both of these kinds of things help. 45Q as well is something that helps. Anything that equalizes the playing field. What I would say, however, is we need to be careful. Those policy mechanisms have to be technology neutral, because you're looking at this right now and you couldn't have imagined it 10 years ago, right? And I want to make sure that any policy vehicle also enables things that we are not imagining today to succeed. So they need to be fashioned like the low carbon fuel standard, that's completely technology neutral, outcome based.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I have two similar questions from Vineet Sharma and someone, an anonymous person, related to how capital intensive your process is compared to traditional fossil fuel refining. And how do you see it scaling different than as compared to traditional oil and gas?
No, absolutely. So the first question is, how do I see it scaling? And this is why I talked about ethanol being a way to move residues, like, pockets of carbon that are trapped, shall we say, in municipal solid waste. So I imagine distributed production. In terms of cost, I would say the capital intensity, the way the refiners think about it. So the plant in China is on the order of $3 a gallon of annual production, right? So it is more capital intensive. The way I think of refining, it tends to run in the dollar an annual gallon as opposed to $3 an annual gallon. Can we get to $1 an annual gallon? Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work. We're doing a lot of process intensification. After you build the first one, you can do process intensification, and we're doing that. And we're looking at different ways of delivering, but $1 a gallon is a long way away. So this is going to be more capital intensive than a unit operation in a refinery. I would say, however, it'll be more selective to specific products. So when we start to make MEG, that will be the only product. There'll be no co-products. So less unit operations, but each will be more capital intensive.
Got it. Thank you. You mentioned 45Q when you were answering Lee's question, and when I think of CCUS, you first and foremost think of the U as EOR. How common do you think your approach will become over the next few years as 45Q gets further developed, as that policy mechanism actually takes hold?
Actually, I think it will become increasingly important. And the reason I say that is because I see a lot of people, not just our technology, a lot of other technologies, a lot of people focused on carbon utilization approaches. And so I see that as becoming increasingly valuable.
Got it. We've got a great question from Matt Zeiss at DOE. And he asks, does this carbon conversion occur from exporting the commodity and importing the refined products? And if so, has this already raised policy concerns on preventing domestic production or conversion options? If so, what does the domestic recycling option look like?
Great question. So I think in general, these facilities tend to be small enough that export import is going to be only at a specific time. So for example, I'll give you an example, the China plant, we are using that ethanol in Europe for other things, but only because the Ghent plant isn't up and running. This is the type of technology that you would want to put regionally where you want to use it. So I don't think it prevents export import. And the one thing it does do is it enables jobs, engineering jobs and other jobs right now where the technology was developed. So I see it as a great enabler.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Question from Atlanta Council Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of our Foresight Strategy and Risks Initiative, Peter Engelke. He says, this is such a hopeful model. So he's very appreciative of your work here. And he asks, how do you envision a future with greatly reduced plastic pollution? So reduction of plastics in the ocean and other bodies of water. How does that both impact your business model if you're thinking about using recycled plastic versus, how do you see you can positively help reduce the amount of single-use plastics?
Yeah, so my view is that using plastics and having an avenue that economically recycles plastic into virgin product, like the chemical recycling I showed, is gonna drive a world where people, instead of throwing things away, actually choose to reuse them. And by that, I mean, if you have an avenue where you can, say, use a post-consumer good or even an in-process manufacturing good, what that means is there will be an outlet to reuse that carbon, to reuse that plastic. I would tell you, a lot of people tell me the same thing. Someday steel mills will stop existing, and what will that do to your model? And my view is, what, we can use so many feedstocks I showed you. So as one disappears, a new feedstock will appear. I also think a gasifier is like a trash can, like we start with a certain mix, and then 5 years later, when the mix changes, we use that mix. So I'm not worried about having enough sources of carbon.
Question about the company. LanzaTech started in New Zealand, now is based in Chicago. How did this all get started? Could you tell us sort of your story of where this came from, why you're now in the US, and what it means to think about your work globally, just having moved the company across the world, entirely across the world, basically?
Sure. And so the company was founded by Sean Simpson. There were two founders. Sean Simpson was one of them. He's our chief scientific officer right now. So he's still the brilliant mind behind this work. And he founded the company in New Zealand. And his view at the time was he was looking for non-food feedstocks. And he was aware of bacteria that could eat gas emissions. And so that's how the company got started. Went to the German library that stores bacteria, found the right ones, brought them to New Zealand, and started using them. New Zealand was a great place to start, but New Zealand is very tough to travel from, and in trying to create a global community and a global company, moving out of there became important. And to be honest, there are also some very strong restrictions on GMO work. And we got really excited about the chemicals work, direct chemical production, as being something we wanted to do in the future. And that was easier to do in the United States. And lots of talent here as well. So yeah, and we draw, actually it's really cool. LanzaTech has about 25 nationalities in LanzaTech. We draw from all over the world. But we also, a lot of folks from the US.
It's like the Atlanta Council. We're very proud of our international workforce. I think we're something like 40% international right now, which is great. I think really helps bring in a range of perspectives. You mentioned that it is difficult to develop certain technologies in New Zealand. What countries do you think have the friendliest policies for this type of work?
Well, actually, I think from an innovation perspective, I'm seeing that happen globally now. I think, I see innovation and ideas and incubators and all of this everywhere in the world. From a regulatory framework and an R&D framework, probably for the types of things we're doing, the US is the best. But honestly, I think there are other parts of the world that are also great from an end product perspective, where biomass can be defined broadly and things like that. So it depends, as long as you can work globally, as long as you can get on an airplane, which I can't do right now. I think we can make it work globally. We're really excited to be able to work globally.
Great. This is a good follow-on question, a question from an anonymous audience member that I really like. This audience member asks, in the long term, do you see developing local conversion devices to supply all of our needs, i.e. chemical, fuels, et cetera? And how might you couple this with local renewable energy sources? So essentially asking, is it possible to have this in a distributed fashion so that we can have circular economies right here wherever you are in the world? Where you're
Yeah.
in Colorado, I'm in Maryland. Can we each have our own little LanzaTech machine?
Okay, so I don't imagine them as our own little LanzaTech machines. You know, people ask me, can you miniaturize it, put it on the back end of a car and so on. But if we can think a little bit bigger, like a small refinery in
Mm-hmm.
Colorado, in Washington, in India, then yes, I see that. And I see then the local sources of carbon being converted there efficiently. Absolutely, that's what I'm looking for, is a distributed approach to making this ethanol or other products. What I would say, though, is I hope that we are not the only solution. In other words, what I want is so many ideas and so many approaches that we can talk about distributed production and other centralized approaches. Renewable power couples really beautifully with this, because renewable power reduces our carbon footprint. We are about compressors, right? And compressors take energy. So the greener the grid gets, the better our life cycle emissions. And of course, we can couple it with electrolysis, right? The greener the grid, the more electrolysis we can do. So this whole plug and play mentality and world that I imagine is actually perfect to couple with renewable power.
So you said you want to see a world with many different solutions. What are some of the other solutions that you think we need that would complement what you're already doing?
That's a great question. I think I'm excited about looking at electrolysis of CO2 to CO, because CO is the perfect feedstock for us. I am excited about people who are integrating into a refinery. I don't want to think of, hey, I'm going to put a LanzaTech technology on the back end of a PSA unit. I want people to think, I'm going to rebalance my refinery and then take any excess carbon or any excess hydrogen and dump it into this unit operation. So I like to think about integration. So I'm interested just even in LP models that allow us to integrate. So it doesn't have to be rocket science to enable a technology to have an impact.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question as we're running out of time. And this is from Hazel Henderson, who is a private investor, which is the kind of person you want to have on these innovation streams. And Hazel asks, is your company privately held?
Yes, it is. LanzaTech is privately held.
Well, if Hazel wants to contact you, how can I have her reach out?
My email, which
Okay.
you can share, with everybody. It's just Jennifer@LanzaTech.com.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much. This was really, really fantastic. An incredible, incredibly inspiring technology that is already in the works, but has many more opportunities for deployment, not just this year and next, but well into the future. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at another Atlantic Council event soon, perhaps our Veterans Advanced Energy Summit in Chicago in August. Thank you all in the audience for tuning in. And really, again, thank you, Jennifer. You can follow Jennifer on Twitter at TotaDogs and at LanzaTech. Thanks to the team who helped put this event together, Olga Kokova, Natalie Murla, Jackson Styron, Laura Macedo, and Roger Morales. I hope you all will join us for our next innovation stream with Michael Weber, Chief Science and Technology Officer at Engie, who will discuss the deployment of low-carbon gases next Thursday, May 7th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Also, for those of you interested in nuclear, please join us for a conversation with Dr. Rita Baranwal, the Assistant Secretary at DOE in the Office of Nuclear, for a briefing on the new Nuclear Fuel Working Group report. That will be this Friday, May 1st at 10:30 a.m. Information about all these events are on the Atlantic Council website. This presentation will be available on the Atlantic Council website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So please do share it with your colleagues. if you're interested, and always feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or if you have any ideas for future innovation streams. Thank you again so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time.